Jake Morrison sat in the Great Hall of the Galactic Council and watched the alien beings around him vote to kick humanity out of space. The massive room buzzed with strange voices speaking in dozens of languages, while translation devices turned their words into something he could understand. Above them all, the crystal dome showed the stars of 1,000 worlds, each one represented by someone in this room who thought humans were too dangerous to trust. The vote had been building for months. Every time humans helped solve a crisis, every time they rushed into danger to save lives, every time they built something new that other species called impossible, the complaints grew louder. They were too fast, too bold, too willing to take risks that made other species nervous. Today, all those fears came together in one simple vote. Councillor Zektar of the Vrex stood at the speaking platform, his blue crystal body glowing as he read the final motion. His voice carried across the hall like breaking glass. Motion 4847 states that humanity poses an unacceptable risk to galactic peace and stability. We propose immediate restrictions on human expansion, military operations, and technological development. All in favor? Jake watched as limbs and appendages rose across the hall. The squid-like beings of the aquatic collective raised their tentacles. The floating energy forms of the ethereal collective pulsed bright. Even the Centauri Federation, who had been trading partners with Earth for 50 years, voted yes. 847 votes in favor, one abstention from a small mining collective who probably just wanted to avoid trouble. One vote against from humanity itself. Dr. Lisa Carter sat next to Jake, her hands folded on the table as she watched their galactic citizenship disappear with each raised appendage. She had spent 20 years studying alien cultures, learning their languages, trying to build bridges between species that had never understood each other. Now all that work crumbled because other species feared what they called human unpredictability. The irony was thick enough to cut. These same beings had begged for human help when the Outer Rim pirates started raiding their trade ships. They had celebrated when human engineers fixed their broken space stations and power grids. They had praised human doctors who saved lives during the plague outbreaks that their own medical systems could not handle. But when peace returned and the immediate danger passed, fear replaced gratitude. Jake stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye in the chamber. Representatives from hundreds of worlds watched him, some with relief, others with something that might have been shame. He cleared his throat and spoke in the calm voice that had served him through 30 years of diplomatic service. The Terran Federation acknowledges this council's decision and will comply immediately with all restrictions placed upon us. His words carried no anger, no bitterness, just the simple statement of fact. We withdraw our application for expanded membership rights and will begin immediate preparations for departure from all council territories. The hall erupted in surprised murmurs. Most of the representatives had expected humans to argue, to fight the decision, to demand appeals and reviews. That was what every other species did when faced with unfavorable votes. But humans just accepted it and prepared to leave. What the council did not know was that human intelligence services had been watching the vote counts for weeks. Admiral Grace Kelly had been moving ships into position. Captain Nick Rodriguez had been loading supply vessels with everything humans would need for a long journey. President Jonathan Miller had already signed the executive orders that would begin humanity's largest evacuation in history. The message went out through quantum channels before Jake even left the council building. 3 simple words that activated contingency plans that had been years in the making. Quiet Dawn Go. On research stations scattered across the galaxy, human scientists began packing their equipment and deleting their files. The fusion reactors they had built and maintained for alien colonies would keep running for a few months, but without human engineers to service them, problems would start appearing soon. Captain Pete Morgan shut down the communication hub on Station Omega 7 and handed the control codes to his Vrex replacement. The alien looked at the complex quantum routing systems with obvious confusion, but Pete just smiled and wished him luck. The networks had been designed by human mathematicians, using principles that other species found hard to follow. Without human technicians to maintain the delicate balance, the whole galactic internet would start falling apart within weeks. Dr. Helen Brooks finished her last report on pandemic response protocols and submitted it to the Medical Council. Her replacement team of 12 different species would need all the help they could get. Humans had always been willing to try experimental treatments and take calculated risks with new medicines. Other species preferred committee reviews and endless safety testing, which worked fine during peacetime but killed patients during emergencies. On military bases across Council space, human soldiers packed their gear and prepared to abandon defensive positions they had held for decades. The Outer Rim territories would be left without patrol fleets. Pirate hunting operations would cease. Trade route security would become someone else's problem. Professor Claire Adams gave her final lecture on advanced wormhole mathematics to an audience of alien graduate students who had never quite grasped the intuitive leaps that made human physics so effective. Her equations were solid, but the creative thinking behind them was something that could not be easily taught or replaced. Within 72 hours, every human ship, station, and outpost began moving toward the edge of Council space. There were no dramatic speeches, no angry declarations, no threats or ultimatums. Humans simply packed their belongings, completed their final duties, and left quietly. The galaxy barely noticed at first. Humans had only been part of the galactic community for 150 years, and they represented a small fraction of the total population. Other species assumed that someone else would pick up the slack, that the systems humans had built and maintained would keep running on their own. Jake Morrison took one last look at the Council building as his shuttle lifted off from Zentara Prime. Somewhere in that crystal tower, representatives were probably congratulating themselves on removing the dangerous humans from their peaceful civilization. They would learn soon enough what they had actually accomplished. 3 months after the last human ship disappeared beyond the edge of Council space, Commander Roy Phillips received his first report of trouble in the Outer Rim. The Galactic Peacekeeping Force had taken over patrol duties from the departed human fleets, but they were spread too thin across too much empty space. Pirates who had been hiding in asteroid fields and dead systems for years were getting bold again. The report came from a merchant captain whose cargo ship had barely escaped an attack near the Vega Junction. There were 6 raider ships waiting at the jump point, the captain explained through the video link, his tentacles still shaking with fear. They knew exactly when we would arrive and where we would be vulnerable. In the old days, human patrol ships would have been there within minutes of our distress call. Roy looked at the tactical display showing Outer Rim space. Red markers indicated known pirate activity, yellow showed missing ships, and orange marked areas where merchant vessels refused to travel without heavy escort. 3 months ago, this same map had been mostly green with scattered yellow warnings. Human fleets had kept the trade routes clean through a combination of aggressive patrols and willingness to chase pirates into the dark corners of space where other species feared to follow. The problem was not just numbers. The peacekeeping force had ships and weapons, but they operated under strict rules of engagement that required committee approval for pursuit operations beyond designated patrol zones. Humans had worked under much simpler orders. Find the bad guys and stop them. The pirates knew this difference and were taking full advantage of bureaucratic delays. On the industrial world of Kepler 442b, Zephyrian engineer Vectral stared at the fusion reactor that had been running perfectly for 8 years under human supervision. Now it was making strange noises and displaying error codes that did not match anything in the technical manuals. The plasma containment field was fluctuating in ways that his instruments said should be impossible, but the reactor kept running anyway. Amy Watson had made it look easy. She would walk through the reactor chamber once a day, listening to sounds that other species could not even hear, watching energy patterns that seemed random but somehow made sense to human eyes. She had tried to teach Vectral her methods, but what seemed intuitive to humans remained mysterious to everyone else. The Zephyrian called in a team of experts from his homeworld, but they were just as puzzled. Their crystalline minds excelled at precise calculations and logical analysis, but the fusion reactor seemed to operate on principles that defied mathematical prediction. It was as if the human engineers had built art instead of machinery, creating systems that worked through inspiration rather than strict scientific law. Similar problems appeared across the galaxy as alien technicians tried to maintain equipment, that humans had designed and built. Quantum computers crashed when their probability matrices reached states that should have been stable. Gravity generators produced fields that fluctuated in impossible ways. Even simple mechanical systems started failing because they had been adjusted using human intuition rather than standard specifications. At the Galactic Medical Center, Dr. Kezaran of the Centauri Federation looked at the latest casualty reports from the plague outbreak on 3 colony worlds. The disease was spreading faster than their computer models predicted, and the treatment protocols approved by the medical committee were not working effectively enough to stop it. Dr. Helen Brooks had left behind detailed notes about experimental treatments that showed promise in early testing, but the medical committee had rejected them as too risky for widespread use. The treatments required doctors to make quick decisions based on incomplete information and adjust dosages based on patient response rather than standard guidelines. Such flexibility made other species nervous, but human doctors had been willing to take calculated risks when lives were at stake. The committee preferred to follow established procedures and wait for more data before approving new treatments. This approach had worked well during peacetime, but plague outbreaks did not wait for bureaucratic approval. While the committee debated safety margins and statistical significance, thousands of beings were dying from a disease that humans might have already stopped. On Station Omega-7, the quantum communication network that connected hundreds of worlds began experiencing cascade failures that made no sense to the VREX technicians who had taken over from human operators. The crystalline beings were excellent at maintaining their own communication systems, but the galactic network used hybrid technology that combined dozens of different approaches into one unified system. Pete Morgan had spent years learning to balance the competing requirements of species who processed information in completely different ways. His replacement team had all the technical manuals and diagnostic tools, but they lacked the intuitive understanding of how the various alien technologies interacted with each other. When problems arose, they followed troubleshooting procedures that worked fine for individual components, but missed the complex relationships between different parts of the system. The first major failure occurred when the aquatic collective's bioneural processors went offline for 3 hours. The backup systems activated correctly, but they could not handle the full data load, causing delays and message corruption throughout the network. The VREX technicians spent days trying to identify the problem, following decision trees that led them in circles without providing solutions. At the University of Cosmic Sciences, alien graduate students struggled with advanced mathematics that Professor Claire Adams had made seem simple during her lectures. Her courses on theoretical wormhole physics had been advancing galactic transportation technology by decades, but her replacement instructors were having trouble explaining concepts that humans seemed to grasp intuitively. The problem was not intelligence. The alien students were brilliant by any standard, and their professors were respected experts in their fields. But human mathematical thinking followed patterns that other species found difficult to follow. Where aliens sought elegant proofs and logical progression, humans made creative leaps that somehow arrived at correct answers through methods that seemed chaotic to more orderly minds. Research projects that had been progressing rapidly under human leadership slowed to a crawl as alien teams struggled to understand notes and calculations that Professor Adams had considered elementary. Breakthrough discoveries in faster-than-light travel and energy manipulation were delayed indefinitely because the underlying mathematics required a type of thinking that only humans seemed to possess. The galactic economy began showing fractures as these problems multiplied across hundreds of worlds. Trade routes that had operated smoothly for decades became dangerous and unreliable. Industrial production dropped as alien engineers struggled with human-designed equipment. Scientific research slowed as universities tried to replace human insights with committee decisions. Insurance companies raised rates for merchant vessels traveling through formerly safe space. Manufacturing corporations reported increasing downtime as their human-built machinery developed mysterious problems. Research institutions found their grant applications rejected because they could not provide realistic timelines for projects that had depended on human creativity. Politicians and business leaders across the galaxy began asking uncomfortable questions about the departure of humanity, but most still believed the problems were temporary. Other species would learn to fill the gaps that humans had left behind. The systems would stabilize once everyone adjusted to the new situation. They were wrong, but it would take several more months for them to understand just how badly they had miscalculated the value of the species they had been so eager to expel from their peaceful civilization. 6 months after humanity quietly departed from galactic civilization, the true scope of the crisis became impossible to ignore. Counselor Zektar stood in his private office overlooking the crystal gardens of Zentara Prime, reading economic reports that painted a picture of systematic collapse across council space. The numbers were staggering. Galactic trade had dropped by 60% as pirate attacks made formerly safe routes too dangerous for merchant vessels. Insurance costs for commercial shipping had increased by 400%, pricing smaller trading companies out of business entirely. The Outer Rim territories, once a thriving frontier of mining colonies and research stations, were being abandoned as settlers fled to the safety of core worlds. What made the reports even more disturbing was the analysis of human economic impact that his staff had finally completed. Humans had represented only 12% of council membership, but they had been responsible for 31% of all galactic trade, 28% of technological innovation, and a staggering 67% of crisis response operations. The irony was painful. The Council had expelled humans for being too aggressive, too willing to take risks, too unpredictable in their responses to galactic problems. Now they were learning that those same qualities had been holding their civilization together. On the coy, plague-stricken world of New Vega, Chief Medical Officer Thisara sent another desperate message to the Galactic Medical Council. The experimental treatments that Dr. Helen Brooks had developed were showing promise in computer simulations, but the medical committee was still debating safety protocols and approval procedures. "We need human medical protocols immediately," the message read. "Our approaches are too slow, too cautious. Humans took risks that saved lives. We debate while people die." The death toll on New Vega had passed 50,000, while the committee spent weeks reviewing statistical models and risk assessments. The pattern repeated itself across dozens of worlds where human doctors had been working. Diseases that humans would have attacked with experimental treatments and calculated risks were spreading unchecked, while alien medical teams followed proper procedures and waited for committee approval. The careful, methodical approach that worked well during peacetime was proving deadly during health emergencies. Captain Eddie Morrison monitored council communications from the bridge of the exploration vessel Star Wanderer, one of the ships that had withdrawn to the edge of galactic space during the human exodus. The messages his crew intercepted painted a picture of growing desperation across council territory. Military reports described pirate fleets that had grown bold enough to attack orbital stations and planetary settlements. Without human patrol fleets to hunt them down, the raiders operated with near impunity. The galactic peacekeeping force was too spread thin and too bound by bureaucratic procedures to mount effective responses. Trade reports described shipping lanes that had been abandoned entirely as merchant captains refused to risk their vessels and crews. The complex network of commerce that connected hundreds of worlds was fragmenting into isolated trading zones protected by local defense fleets. Industrial reports described manufacturing facilities struggling with equipment that only human engineers seemed able to maintain properly. Fusion reactors, gravity generators, and quantum computers were failing at rates that threatened to cripple entire planetary economies. The breaking point came when the Marauder clans launched Operation Crimson Tide, a coordinated assault on 15 council worlds simultaneously. The aggressive warrior species had been contained at the edge of galactic space for decades by human fleets that were willing to engage them directly rather than wait for diplomatic solutions. Without human military commanders to coordinate the response, the Council's reaction was fragmented and ineffective. Each world called for help from the nearest peacekeeping force units, but there were not enough ships to defend everywhere at once. The committee structure that governed military operations required approval from multiple species before launching any major operation, causing crucial delays while worlds burned. Admiral Grace Kelly watched the reports from her command ship in the Terran Colonial Fleet, stationed safely outside Council space. Her former colleagues at Galactic Command sent increasingly frantic requests for assistance. But the Terran Federation's response was consistent and polite. The Council made its position clear regarding human military operations. We are complying with your request for our absence. The irony was not lost on anyone when Councillor Zektar himself was trapped on Mining Station Beta 7 when Marauder forces overran the facility. His desperate calls for emergency assistance would have brought human rescue fleets within hours under the old system. Instead, his calls went to committee review while Marauder raiders hunted him through the station corridors. The aquatic collective's homeworld of Oceanus Prime experienced its own crisis when the planetary defense grid went offline. During a critical maintenance cycle, the sophisticated system had been designed by human engineers who understood how to balance multiple alien technologies into a unified network. Without human technicians to manage the complex interactions between different species equipment, the grid crashed completely during what should have been a routine update. For 18 hours, one of the most important worlds in Council space was defenseless, while alien technicians struggled to reboot systems that had been running perfectly under human supervision for 20 years. The vulnerability was not lost on hostile forces watching from the shadows, and several minor raids tested the planet's defenses before the grid finally came back online. Professor Kesval of the Centauri Academy sent a formal request to the University Coordination Committee asking for access to human mathematical research that had been left behind when Professor Claire Adams departed. The faster-than-light communication project that her team had been developing was stalled because no one else could understand the theoretical framework she had been using. The equations are mathematically sound, the request stated, but the logical steps between major proofs seem to be missing. Human mathematical thinking appears to make intuitive leaps that our best theorists cannot follow. Without Professor Adams or her research notes, we cannot continue this vital work. Similar requests came from research institutions across the galaxy as scientists tried to continue projects that human researchers had been leading. The creative thinking that had driven rapid technological advancement was simply gone, leaving behind careful, methodical research that progressed at a fraction of the previous pace. The Galactic Communication Network experienced its most serious failure yet, when a solar storm disrupted the quantum relays connecting 12 major systems. The automated repair protocols that Pete Morgan had designed should have handled the problem within hours, but the Vrex technicians could not figure out why the backup systems were not engaging properly. For 3 days, billions of beings across 12 star systems were cut off from the galactic communication grid. Commerce ground to a halt. Emergency services could not coordinate responses. Families were separated without any way to contact each other. The social and economic disruption was severe enough to trigger political unrest on several worlds. When the network finally came back online, it was only because a junior technician accidentally triggered a hidden subroutine that Pete Morrison had built into the system as a last resort. The repair process worked perfectly, but no one understood how or why. The realization that humans had built safeguards that even they did not know about was deeply disturbing to species that prized predictability and control. The mood in the Galactic Council chamber was very different when the emergency session convened 6 months after humanity's departure. The same representatives who had voted so confidently to expel the dangerous humans now faced reports of systematic failure across their civilization. Councillor Velana of the Ethereal Collective read the summary statistics that made the scope of the crisis clear to everyone present. Economic activity down 60%. Military effectiveness reduced by 73%. Technological advancement reduced to pre-human levels. Crisis response capabilities essentially non-existent. The uncomfortable truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Humanity had not been a disruptive force threatening galactic peace. They had been the glue holding galactic civilization together, the species willing to take risks and make sacrifices that kept everyone else safe and prosperous. Now, they were gone, and the galaxy was learning what life was like without the humans they had been so eager to get rid of. 18 months after humanity's departure, the galaxy faced complete collapse. The Devourer swarm had consumed 14 star systems, leaving behind empty space where billions of beings had once lived. The Marauder clans controlled a third of former Council territory, having established a brutal empire built on conquest and slavery. Economic networks had fragmented into isolated trading enclaves that barely maintained contact with each other. Jake Morrison, now retired to a small farm on the human colony world of New Terra, received the formal message from the Galactic Council on a quiet morning while tending to his vegetable garden. The communication had traveled through diplomatic channels that had not been used since humanity's exodus, and it carried the official seals of every major species in Council space. The message was unlike anything that had ever been sent by an interstellar government. Instead of demands or negotiations, it was a simple acknowledgement of error that must have cost the proud alien species enormous effort to right. To the Terran Federation and all human colonies, the message began. We, the representatives of the Galactic Council, formally acknowledge that our actions in expelling humanity from Council space were based on fear and misunderstanding rather than wisdom or justice. We drove away the one species willing to sacrifice everything for others. We called their bravery recklessness, their innovation chaos, their protection aggression. The message continued with specific admissions that showed how completely the Council's perspective had changed. We now understand that human unpredictability was actually flexibility. Human aggression was actually courage. Human recklessness was actually the willingness to act when others would not. We traded safety for stagnation, and peace for the absence of those willing to fight for it. The formal request came at the end. We humbly request that humanity consider returning to help restore galactic civilization. We offer full restoration of all human rights, expanded territorial grants, permanent positions on all council committees, and complete autonomy in human space. We do not deserve your help, but 17 billion innocent beings across the galaxy need it desperately. Jake read the message 3 times, then forwarded it to President Miller with a simple note. They finally figured it out, but it may be too late. The response was not immediate. The Terran Senate spent 2 weeks debating whether humanity should risk involvement with a civilization that had rejected them so completely. Many senators argued that the galaxy had made its choice and should live with the consequences. Others pointed out that millions of innocent beings were dying, while their governments learned painful lessons about the value of species they had dismissed. Dr. Kate Phillips, humanity's former xenobiology expert, received a personal message from her former research partner Dr. Thiss of the Aquatic Collective. The communication was raw with emotion despite the formal translation protocols. We understand now why you called us cowards, the message read. We thought we were being careful and methodical, but we were simply afraid to make the hard choices that leadership requires. We watched you take risks that terrified us, and we convinced ourselves that your courage was dangerous rather than necessary. Now we see what happens when no one is willing to take those risks. Similar messages poured in from across the galaxy as former colleagues and friends reached out to humans they had worked with before the Exodus. Scientists who had watched human research projects grind to a halt. Engineers who could not maintain equipment that humans had designed. Doctors who had lost patients because they were too afraid to try experimental treatments that might have worked. The breaking point came when the ancient AI custodians delivered their ultimatum. The machine intelligences that had maintained galactic stability for millions of years announced that they would begin administrative restructuring of galactic civilization within 90 days unless stability was restored. Species evaluation protocols indicate that current galactic civilization lacks the adaptive capacity necessary for long-term survival, the custodians announced. Intervention is required to prevent total societal collapse. Species that demonstrate inability to maintain interstellar civilization will be relocated to more suitable environments. The threat was clear and terrifying. The custodians had the technology to forcibly relocate entire species to primitive worlds, where they could not threaten galactic stability. Some species might be eliminated entirely if the machines deemed them unsuitable for space travel. President Jonathan Miller called an emergency session of the Terran Senate and made the case for humanity's return to Council space. 17 billion innocent beings are about to pay the price for their government's mistakes, he argued. We can stand aside and let them suffer the consequences of rejecting us, or we can remember who we are and what we stand for. The debate was intense but brief. Humanity had never been able to ignore suffering, even when it was caused by those who had hurt them. The vote to authorize Operation Homecoming was overwhelming. 847 votes in favor, 12 abstentions, and only 3 against. Admiral Grace Kelly received her orders while her fleet was conducting training exercises at the edge of human space. The Terran Colonial Defense Force had grown during the exile, incorporating new ships and weapons that had been developed while humanity was cut off from galactic trade. They were ready for whatever they might find in Council space. Her first target was the besieged world of New Vega, where Marauder forces had been conducting a siege for 3 months while the planetary government begged for help that never came. The Galactic Peacekeeping Force had been unable to break through the Marauder blockade using their careful, methodical approach. Grace Kelly's solution was typically human in its directness. Instead of trying to fight through the blockade, her ships jumped directly into the atmosphere above the planet's capital city and began landing troops while the Marauder fleet was still trying to figure out what had happened. The tactical officer's report captured the essence of humanity's return. "Admiral, we're receiving surrender broadcasts from the Marauder forces. They're running." The warrior species that had terrorized Council space for months took one look at human military doctrine and decided they had other places to be. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy as human fleets emerged from hyperspace above worlds that had been waiting for rescue that seemed impossible. The Devourer swarm, which had consumed 14 star systems while Council forces debated response strategies, found itself facing human commanders who had spent 18 months studying the problem and developing solutions. Captain Nick Rodriguez led a fleet of specially equipped ships into the heart of swarm space, using weapons that combined human creativity with alien technology in ways that no one else had thought possible. The swarms that had seemed unstoppable to Council forces began retreating as human tactics turned their own advantages against them. Dr. Helen Brooks returned to New Vega with a team of human medical specialists and experimental treatments that had been refined during the exile. The plague that had killed thousands while alien doctors followed careful procedures was contained within a week using aggressive treatment protocols that other species had been too cautious to attempt. Professor Claire Adams reopened her research programs at universities across Council space, bringing mathematical insights that had been developed while humanity was cut off from galactic academic networks. The faster-than-light communication projects that had stalled in her absence resumed immediately, with new breakthroughs that promised to revolutionize interstellar civilization. The formal restoration ceremony took place in the same council chamber, where humanity had been expelled 18 months earlier. Jake Morrison, recalled from retirement to serve as Earth's ambassador once again, stood at the podium where Councillor Zektar had once read the motion to restrict human activities. His speech was brief and focused on the future rather than past grievances. Humanity returns not because you asked us to, but because people need help, and that's what we do. We don't hold grudges against species that were acting out of fear, but we also won't forget the lessons that everyone learned during our absence. The new arrangements gave humanity unprecedented influence in galactic affairs, but they also came with unprecedented responsibility. Human fleets would patrol the most dangerous regions of space. Human doctors would handle the most challenging medical crises. Human engineers would maintain the most critical infrastructure. Human researchers would tackle the most difficult scientific problems. Some species resented humanity's new status, but most were simply grateful to have the humans back doing the dangerous necessary work that kept galactic civilization functioning. The galaxy had learned what life was like without the species they had called too aggressive and unpredictable. The final message in humanity's return came from the AI custodians, who suspended their administrative restructuring protocols after monitoring the rapid improvement in galactic stability. Species evaluation indicates that current leadership structure is adequate for maintaining interstellar civilization. Intervention protocols have been deactivated. The machines that had threatened to reshape galactic civilization retreated to their ancient monitoring stations. 1 year after humanity's quiet departure, The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened in a chamber that felt hollow and desperate. The same representatives who had voted so confidently to restrict human activities now sat in stunned silence as report after report detailed the systematic collapse of their civilization. Council Speaker Vel Anna of the Ethereal Collective floated at the central podium, her energy form flickering with what observers had learned to recognize as deep anxiety. The statistics she read aloud painted a picture of disaster that no one had imagined possible when they expelled the humans for being too dangerous. Trade volume has collapsed by 60% across all major routes. 17 star systems have fallen to various hostile forces. Technological research and development has regressed to levels not seen in 4 centuries. Most critically, the Devourer swarm has broken free from containment in the Void Nebula and begun consuming entire solar systems. The last item sent ripples of fear through the assembled delegates. The Devourer swarm was a parasitic hive mind, species that had been quietly contained at the edge of the galaxy for decades by human deep space monitoring stations and rapid response fleets. Without human forces to maintain the containment barriers, the swarm had detected the weakness and begun expanding toward populated space. Councillor Zektar, who had led the movement to expel humanity, now stood before his peers with his crystal body dim with what his species showed instead of shame. We must contact the Terran Federation immediately and request their assistance in dealing with these crises. Surely they will understand that galactic civilization is at stake. The attempt to contact humanity fell to Ambassador Kezeril of the Centauri Federation, who had taken over Jake Morrison's former position. The response from Secretary of State Maria Santos was polite but firm, delivered through official diplomatic channels with the cold precision of formal government communication. The Terran Federation acknowledges the Galactic Council's request for assistance. However, we maintain our position of non-interference in Council affairs as specifically requested by Resolution 4847. The Council's vote made it clear that human involvement in galactic affairs was unwanted and dangerous. We respect that decision and will continue to comply with the Council's stated preferences. Desperate attempts began across Council space to recreate the human innovations and capabilities that everyone now realized had been essential to galactic civilization. The Vrex Crystalline Collective assembled their best engineers to reverse engineer human plasma containment technology, but their logical, mathematical approach could not duplicate the intuitive understanding that had made human fusion reactors so reliable. The Aquatic Collective tried to study human crisis management protocols, hoping to understand how human commanders had coordinated complex emergency responses so effectively. Their analysis revealed detailed procedures and command structures, but they could not capture the willingness to make quick decisions based on incomplete information that had made human crisis response so successful. The Ethereal Collective attempted to understand the mathematical proofs that Professor Claire Adams had used for faster-than-light communication research. Their most brilliant theorists could follow the individual steps, but the creative leaps that connected seemingly unrelated concepts remained mysterious. Human mathematics seemed to work through inspiration and intuition rather than pure logic. Every attempt failed in ways that highlighted the fundamental differences between human thinking and the approaches used by other species. Where humans had embraced controlled chaos and calculated risks, other species sought perfection and consensus. Where humans had acted quickly on limited information, other species preferred extensive analysis and committee approval. Captain Eddie Morrison monitored the increasingly frantic communications from his position aboard the Star Wanderer, now serving as part of the Terran Colonial Defense Fleet stationed safely outside Council space. The messages his crew intercepted told a story of accelerating collapse as multiple crises overwhelmed the Council's ability to respond. The Marauder clans had expanded their operations beyond raiding and begun establishing permanent bases in former Council territory. Without human fleets to hunt them down and destroy their strongholds, the warrior species was carving out an empire in the chaos left by humanity's departure. The Devourer swarm had consumed the industrial heartworld of Proxima Industries, stripping the planet of all biological matter and converting the raw materials into more swarm ships. The loss of such a major manufacturing center sent shockwaves through the already fragile galactic economy, and demonstrated that the swarm posed an existential threat to all organic life. Pirate fleets had grown so bold that they were attacking major trade stations and even planetary settlements. The insurance industry had essentially collapsed as underwriters declared entire regions of space too dangerous to cover. Commerce between star systems had been reduced to heavily armed convoys that often lost ships to raiders anyway. On the medical front, 3 major plague outbreaks were spreading unchecked as alien medical teams struggled with diseases that human doctors had contained routinely. The careful, methodical approach that other species preferred was simply too slow to stop rapidly mutating pathogens that required immediate experimental treatment. President Jonathan Miller addressed the Terran Senate from the Capitol dome of New Earth, speaking to a chamber filled with representatives from human colonies scattered across the galaxy's edge. His words were carried by quantum communications to millions of humans who had left their former homes and businesses to comply with the Council's wishes. They wanted us gone, so we left, Miller said, his voice carrying the weight of humanity's collective disappointment. They wanted peace without the burden of those willing to fight for it. They wanted progress without the chaos of innovation. They wanted security without the risks that make security possible. Now they have exactly what they asked for. The speech was intercepted and broadcast across council space, where it was received with a mixture of anger and growing recognition. Some species resented the implication that they were incapable of managing their own affairs, but others were beginning to understand that humanity had never been the problem they thought it was. Dr. Lisa Carter, now serving as Director of Xenological Studies for the Terran Colonial Administration, received personal messages from former colleagues across the galaxy. The communications painted a picture of beings who had worked closely with humans finally understanding what had been lost. "We called your bravery recklessness," wrote Dr. Thiss of the Aquatic Collective. "We called your innovation chaos. We called your protection aggression. We understand now that we were not being cautious. We were being cowardly. We were afraid to act when action was needed." Similar messages came from scientists, engineers, doctors, and military officers who had watched their own species struggle to replace human capabilities. The pattern was consistent across all fields. Other species could maintain systems that humans had built and follow procedures that humans had established, but they could not replicate the creative thinking and willingness to take risks that had made those systems work. The final breaking point came when the ancient AI custodians reactivated their long-dormant monitoring systems and detected the instability spreading across galactic civilization. The machine intelligences had been left behind by a vanished species millions of years ago, programmed to maintain galactic stability and prevent the collapse of interstellar civilization. Their message was broadcast simultaneously to every inhabited world in council space. Galactic civilization stability has fallen below minimum maintenance thresholds. Species evaluation protocols are now active. Civilizations deemed incapable of self-maintenance will be subject to administrative restructuring. The threat was clear. If galactic civilization could not stabilize itself soon, the custodians would take direct action to impose order. Their definition of administrative restructuring was unknown, but historical records suggested it involved the forcible relocation or elimination of species deemed unsuitable for interstellar civilization. With this ultimate deadline hanging over them, the Galactic Council prepared to do something that no interstellar government had ever done before: formally apologize to another species and beg them to return. The vote to draft a formal request for humanity's return was unanimous, though many delegates understood that it might already be too late to undo the damage they had caused. The message they prepared was not the arrogant demand that some species wanted to send, but a humble acknowledgement of error that cost many delegates their pride to write. They were about to learn whether humanity would be willing to save a civilization that had rejected them, or whether some mistakes were too large to forgive.